What happens when a careless joke becomes the weapon that tears your family apart? I laughed and said my husband might not be the father, but he took it seriously. Now he is demanding DNA proof in court, and my life is falling apart. My name is Celine Armand, and I am 33 years old, working as a paralegal in a small law office where I should have known better than anyone that words cannot be taken back once spoken. My husband Julian is 36, a high school teacher who has always been calm, steady, and maybe too predictable for me, though I once admired his quiet ways. We have 2 children, Clara, who is 8, and Noah, who is 5, and until recently, nobody had ever questioned that Julian was their father. That night, when everyone was joking around, I laughed too loudly and said something reckless about paternity because I wanted attention and thought it would make me seem daring. Julian went pale while others gasped, and I quickly brushed it off as a joke, but I saw something in his eyes that told me he did not believe me. Since then, he has moved with a quiet resolve that frightens me more than shouting ever could, and I now face the reality that he is demanding legal testing. My mother Vivian insists Julian is overreacting, but my sister Elise says, I crossed a line that can never be erased. Julian's brother Martin refuses to even look at me and openly supports Julian's decision to take this through the courts. What scares me most is that Julian is not yelling or accusing anymore, but calmly building a case that could strip me of the family I always assumed would stay no matter what I said or did. It started with one of those warm summer evenings when family gathers in the backyard for food and laughter, and everyone tries to outdo one another with jokes that are meant to be harmless. I had been sipping wine for a while and felt the familiar rush of being the center of attention when the conversation drifted toward family resemblances. Someone mentioned how Clara looked so much like me, while Noah had Julian's serious expression, and I rolled my eyes dramatically. I wanted to make people laugh, so I leaned in and said with a smirk that maybe Julian was not even the father after all. The words spilled out before I thought about them, and the group gasped, followed by nervous laughter, but I laughed louder than everyone else, pretending it was just a joke. My mother Vivian chuckled and waved it off, saying men always take these things too seriously. But I caught the look on Julian's face as he set down his plate. His smile disappeared completely, and his eyes turned cold in a way I had never seen before, and for a moment I felt a chill run through me despite the warm evening air. I tried to brush it off by saying he needed to lighten up, but he stayed silent for the rest of the night. Later, when we were cleaning up, he asked why I would say something like that, and I snapped back that he was insecure and making problems out of nothing. I thought the matter would fade like every other argument we had, because usually he went quiet and let me take control. This time, the silence felt different because it was not surrender, but calculation. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes in his behavior that unsettled me more than if he had yelled. He came home from school still gentle with the children, but distant with me, speaking only about chores or bills without warmth. At night, he went to bed earlier, leaving me scrolling my phone alone in the living room. I tried to provoke him into talking by saying he was sulking like a child, but he only gave me a calm look and left the room. My mother told me again that men overreact when their pride is touched, and she laughed when I told her Julian was acting cold. My sister Elise, however, warned me quietly that I was playing with fire, and that joking about paternity was the one thing no man could ignore. I told her she was being dramatic and jealous because she had no children of her own, but her serious expression stayed in my mind. A week later, at another small family gathering, my brother-in-law Martin confronted me directly, asking why I would humiliate his brother in front of everyone. I tried to laugh it off, saying he had no sense of humor, but Martin's anger was clear, and he told me I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Julian stayed quiet during the confrontation, only helping Clara with her plate and listening while I defended myself. That silence was heavier than any accusation because it meant he did not need to argue with me anymore. I still convinced myself I could gaslight the situation by telling him he had imagined my tone or misunderstood my words, but deep down I knew he had not. At the office, I found myself distracted, unable to focus on files, because I kept replaying the moment I said the joke. My colleague Eric, who worked as a trainer nearby, texted me asking if I was free for coffee, and I agreed because I needed a distraction. Sitting with him made me feel admired again, and I told myself this was the reason I had joked in the first place, because I was tired of Julian's seriousness. Eric smiled and said I deserved to feel noticed, and I let myself believe it, even though I knew how dangerous that was. That night, Julian asked why I was late, and I lied, easily saying I had been stuck at work preparing documents. He nodded calmly without questioning me, and I felt more nervous about his silence than if he had pressed further. I told my mother later that Julian was becoming controlling and cold, and she repeated that he was too rigid to keep me happy. Elise overheard and told me bluntly that I was destroying my marriage with my own hands, but I told her she was siding with him out of spite. In truth, I felt the shift under my feet, and I knew Julian had changed. He was no longer the man who let my words roll off his back, but someone who had already begun to build a response I could not dismiss as insecurity. I still laughed with Eric during stolen moments at cafes, and convinced myself that Julian was just bluffing with his silence, but the image of his face at the barbecue haunted me. It was the face of a man who had made a decision, and I was too arrogant to see how close I was to losing control of the entire story. The public embarrassment grew sharper a few weeks later when Julian agreed to come with me to dinner with colleagues, even though he never liked those outings and usually preferred staying home with the children. I had pushed him to join because I thought it would look better to show up with a husband at my side, while I enjoyed the playful attention of Eric, who had been invited as well. The restaurant was buzzing with conversation and glasses clinking, while I positioned myself between Julian and Eric as if I could balance both lives at once. Early in the evening, someone asked how long we had been married, and I smiled sweetly, before adding that I was amazed Julian had lasted this long, since he spent his days buried in lesson plans and grading papers. The group chuckled politely, and Eric smirked, while Julian gave me a tight look that I ignored. Later, when someone asked about hobbies, I exaggerated, saying Julian had none beyond staring at textbooks, and that I often felt like I was raising 3 children, not 2. People laughed again, and I basked in the attention while Julian remained silent. When he finally tried to contribute by mentioning a project he was proud of at school, I interrupted with a sigh and said, nobody wanted to hear about classroom discipline over dinner. The table laughed again, and Eric leaned closer with a grin, while Julian's expression grew more withdrawn. I told myself I was being clever and entertaining, but underneath, I was tearing at his dignity with every word. After dessert, Julian excused himself quietly, saying he had to prepare for class the next day, and left while I stayed behind, sipping wine with Eric and others. When Eric asked if everything was fine, I rolled my eyes and said Julian was too sensitive and insecure. He laughed and told me I deserved someone who understood me better, and I let his words sink in, because they gave me the rush I wanted. When I finally got home, Julian was already in bed and said nothing about the evening. The silence pressed down on me, but I tried to dismiss it by telling myself he was sulking like always. The next morning, I called my mother and told her how stiff he had been at dinner, and she repeated her favorite line that men like him could never handle strong women. My sister Elise, who was visiting, overheard the conversation and told me directly that I had humiliated him in public again, and that I was tearing down his reputation in front of strangers. I snapped at her that she was exaggerating and jealous, but her serious look lingered in my mind. That weekend, at another family meal, Martin confronted me in the kitchen while Julian sat at the table with the children. Martin asked if I thought it was funny to make his brother the butt of every joke in front of outsiders. I told him he had no idea what it was like to live with Julian's boring habits, and that I was only trying to keep things interesting. Martin shook his head with disgust and said nothing more, but his expression left me rattled. Back at work, Eric teased me about how quiet Julian had been, and I laughed, saying he never had confidence compared to men like him. Eric smiled, but I noticed a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if even he realized I was reckless. At home, Julian barely spoke beyond the essentials about the children or the bills, and when I tried to provoke him into arguments, he refused to rise to it. One night, he finally asked why I always needed to put him down in front of others, and I quickly said he was imagining insults that were never there. He did not argue or raise his voice, but gave me a long, unreadable look before turning away. That look unsettled me more than anything he had said, because it felt like he had already decided something important. I went to bed that night, telling myself he would forgive me like always, but inside, I could sense the shift. He was no longer hurt, in the same way, but quietly resolved, and I could feel the balance tilting away from me, even though I still pretended to believe I was in control. By the time whispers began spreading around town, I was already far too deep in my choices to stop, and I kept convincing myself that I was clever enough to keep control. At the gym, Eric grew bolder, with his smiles and casual touches, when no one else was looking, and I soaked it up like I'd been starving for attention. One afternoon, a neighbor, who also worked out there, pulled me aside and asked if everything was fine at home, because she had noticed how often Eric and I left the gym together. I laughed it off and said she was reading too much into things. And later that night, when Julian asked why I was always out so late, I snapped that he was becoming paranoid and controlling. I told him he should trust me more, instead of acting suspicious, and that line always silenced him because he hated being accused of unfairness. For a while that tactic worked, because he stopped pressing me with questions, but the way he looked at me became sharper and quieter, and I felt his eyes on me even when he said nothing. At a birthday gathering for one of our children, Martin cornered me again and said bluntly that everyone could see what I was doing and that Julian did not deserve it. I brushed him off by saying he should focus on his own family and stop interfering in mine. But my cheeks burned because I knew people had started talking. My mother Vivian defended me loudly, saying that Julian should be grateful to have a wife like me who still attracted attention, while Elise sat in the corner, watching me with disappointment. Later, she told me in a low voice that I was destroying my marriage in front of everyone, and that soon there would be no way back. I snapped at her for being dramatic, but her words gnawed at me. At the office, I found it harder to concentrate on my files, because the rumors about me and Eric kept circling, and I heard two colleagues whispering as I walked past. Eric himself began pulling back slightly, suggesting that we should be careful about appearances and not give people too much to talk about. I told him not to worry because I had things under control, but even I could feel how fragile my story had become. One evening, when I came home later than usual, Julian was sitting at the dining table with his laptop open and neat piles of papers spread in front of him. When I asked what he was working on, he simply said he had deadlines, but his voice was cold and precise. I felt a jolt of unease, but I told myself he was only trying to make me nervous. A few days later, a colleague mentioned that Julian had been seen waiting in a parked car outside a downtown cafe just as Eric and I walked out together. I forced a laugh and said he must have been running errands, but my stomach tightened because I knew he had probably seen more than he let on. That night, he asked me calmly if I was truly happy in our marriage, and I lashed out saying he was suffocating me with constant questions and should be grateful I had not left him already. I watched something change in his expression at that moment, not anger, but a colder decision settling into place, like a wall I could not break. He went to bed without another word and left me pacing the living room, feeling strangely cornered. I kept telling myself he would eventually calm down like always, but deep inside, I knew he was no longer the man who ignored my jabs and forgave my carelessness. His silence was not weakness anymore, but a strategy, and I had given him all the material he needed to use against me. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread by meeting Eric again during the day and laughing too loudly in cafes, but even Eric seemed nervous now when people looked at us. My control over the story was slipping, and for the first time, I realized Julian was not just watching me, but quietly collecting everything I had been so careless to leave in plain sight. The breaking point came during the school concert where parents filled the decorated auditorium with chatter and camera flashes, and I convinced myself it was another chance to show I was admired. Julian arrived early with the children, making sure Clara and Noah were dressed neatly, while I lingered near the entrance chatting with Eric, who had come under the excuse of supporting a relative. I laughed too loudly at his comments and made sure others noticed me because I wanted to feel important and free. When a group of parents asked about my work, I proudly described long hours and new responsibilities while brushing off Julian by saying he was too quiet and serious to be part of conversations like these. Some people smiled politely, but I noticed several shifting uncomfortably while Julian sat patiently helping the children with their sheet music. Later, when I passed him in the hallway, I whispered sharply that he was embarrassing me by standing aside, and he gave me that same unreadable look before walking away. Elise was also volunteering at the event, and she caught my arm afterward, telling me I was humiliating him again and making myself look foolish in front of other parents. I dismissed her words quickly, saying she was jealous and that she never understood how exhausting it was to live with someone who lacked presence. My mother Vivian arrived halfway through the program, and when I complained about Julian's coldness, she repeated her usual line that he had always been too stiff and that I deserved to shine. Still, I could feel the eyes of teachers and other parents on me, and the shift in their glances unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Eric stayed close during the evening, but I sensed his laughter was forced whenever others were near, as though he too worried about how this looked. When the concert ended, Julian quietly gathered the children's coats and took them home without saying a word, while I lingered chatting with Eric and a few colleagues. I arrived later to find the house strangely quiet and unnervingly organized. The usual clutter of bills and papers that covered the dining table was gone, and several drawers in the study were empty. His laptop was missing, and the atmosphere felt charged with a silence that made me uneasy. The next morning at breakfast, Julian spoke gently with Clara and Noah about their school projects, but addressed me only when necessary, and with a tone that was distant and formal. I tried to provoke him by accusing him of freezing me out, but he remained calm and steady, refusing to rise to my bait. That evening, I overheard him speaking on the phone in the study, and though he lowered his voice when I walked past, I caught enough words like documentation schedules and testing to know he was speaking with a lawyer. Panic gripped me, though I told myself he was bluffing and only trying to scare me. I called my mother and told her Julian was being cruel and controlling, and she repeated that he was punishing me because he could not handle a strong wife. Elise, however, told me directly that Julian was done tolerating my behavior and that he was preparing to act in a way I would not be able to laugh away. I hung up on her, but her words echoed in my mind. That night, when I walked through the silent house again, the missing papers and his steady eyes reminded me that he had already moved beyond arguments and was building something I could not twist into a joke. I realized with a chill that he was no longer trying to win me back or shame me into change, but preparing to expose me in a way that would leave no room for denial. The strike landed not with shouting or slammed doors, but with a plain envelope delivered by a courier who asked me to sign before walking away, leaving me standing in the doorway trembling. Inside were legal documents demanding DNA testing for both Clara and Noah, along with custody review papers and financial protections that I had never expected to see. The pages detailed dates, times, and even photographs of me leaving the gym and cafes with Eric, along with statements from people who had seen us together more often than I realized. Julian had not confronted me directly, but instead had gathered everything carefully with the patience he used in his classroom, turning my own recklessness into evidence. I sat at the dining table staring at the documents, while the children played in the living room, unaware of the storm rising around them. When Julian came home that evening, he greeted them warmly, asking about school projects and helping with their homework, while he addressed me only with clipped politeness. I demanded to know why he was doing this, and he replied calmly that everything would be handled properly and that the children came first. His steady voice frightened me more than anger ever could because it showed he was fully in control. I called my mother Vivian in tears, telling her that Julian was trying to erase me, and she immediately said he was being cruel and vindictive. She insisted he was only punishing me because I refused to be small and quiet. Elise, however, told me directly that Julian was not punishing me at all, but protecting himself and the children after everything I had done. I shouted that she was betraying me, but she only sighed and said the truth was obvious to everyone but me. Later, Martin called and told Julian he was proud of him for taking legal steps and that the family finally saw his strength. I heard this from the hallway and felt my chest tighten because it meant the wider circle already knew about the documents. At work, Eric grew cold and avoided me in the halls, answering my messages with short replies or not at all. When I finally confronted him at the gym, he told me he could not risk being pulled into legal trouble. and that I needed to fix my marriage on my own. I left feeling abandoned and furious, but also desperate, because I had lost the one person I thought understood me. Back at home, I paced the kitchen, night after night, telling myself Julian was bluffing, but every glance at the stamped papers reminded me that this was real. He had frozen certain accounts, making it harder for me to spend freely, and he had filed requests that secured temporary safeguards for the children. My usual tactics of gaslighting and blame shifting no longer worked because he refused to argue. Every time I accused him of being cruel, he responded with silence, or simply reminded me that decisions would be made through proper channels. Even my mother began sounding less certain when I ranted too loudly, because the evidence in his possession was undeniable. I had built my identity on words, on bending the truth to fit my story, but now I was trapped by the very structure of the law, which cared nothing for my explanations. The envelope on the table became a symbol of my loss of control, and each day I stared at it, knowing I could not stop what was coming. Julian's calm strategy had stripped me of the power I always believed I held, and for the first time, I felt cornered by silence stronger than any argument I could ever make. The hearing came faster than I expected, and walking into the courtroom, I felt every eye on me as though everyone already knew the details that I had fought so hard to hide. The walls smelled of old wood and polish, and the air felt too still while Julian sat across from me, with his lawyer calm and steady as ever. I tried to keep my chin high and act unbothered, but inside my stomach churned, because I could already see the neat stack of documents on his lawyer's table. The judge opened with questions about stability and paternity, and Julian's lawyer began laying out the case piece by piece. There were photographs of me leaving the gym with Eric, text logs that showed repeated late nights, and witness statements from neighbors and colleagues who had noticed far more than I imagined. I tried to explain that I had been lonely and that my joke about paternity had been harmless, but the judge's face remained impassive, and the silence in the room grew heavier. When the subject of DNA testing came up, Julian spoke clearly and firmly about the need for certainty for the sake of the children's future. He did not accuse me with anger or raise his voice. He simply laid out the facts and his concerns in a tone that carried weight. My mother Vivian whispered beside me that the court was being unfair, while Elise kept her eyes on the floor, refusing to look at me. Martin sat behind Julian and nodded approvingly each time his lawyer presented another piece of evidence, as though this vindication was long overdue. When I tried to protest that Julian was overreacting, the judge interrupted and reminded me that jokes about paternity have serious consequences when children are involved. My words sounded hollow compared to Julian's calm preparation, and I could feel the tide slipping completely out of my hands. The ruling was delivered firmly that DNA tests for both Clara and Noah would proceed immediately, and that temporary custody arrangements would favor Julian until the results were confirmed. The judge also approved his financial safeguards, ensuring that the children's stability came first. I sat frozen in my chair while Julian gathered his papers and thanked the court with quiet dignity. He did not look at me with triumph or bitterness, only with a finality that made my chest ache. My mother shook her head, muttering that men were heartless, while Elise finally lifted her eyes to me full of disappointment rather than anger. Martin walked out with Julian, placing a hand on his shoulder in silent support. I remained seated, unable to move, staring at the polished table as it sank in that my husband had taken back his dignity and his authority, not with shouting or cruelty, but with patience, evidence, and the law. The silence that followed was heavier than any fight we had ever had, and it was the sound of me losing the control I once believed was mine forever. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.